Mr. Brooks, whose blood pressure was perilously elevated and who exhibited concerning neurological symptoms, was firmly told by a cleaning lady that he needed to go to the hospital immediately. Richard Brooks, the 53-year-old owner of a pharmaceutical empire valued at $2 billion, stared at Kesha Washington, a 42-year-old black woman dressed in her uniform and holding cleaning supplies, as if she had spoken an incomprehensible language, audacious enough to offer him medical advice. Richard, sarcastically chuckling and lowering his cell phone, questioned her, "Are you giving me medical advice now? What is your background again?" "Advanced cleaning." This sarcasm permeated his opulent office on the 30th floor of the Brooks Pharmaceutical Tower. Kesha had just observed Richard staggering, his hands trembling, and his mind appearing confused during a video conference call, symptoms she instantly recognized, but which all the attending executives entirely overlooked. She began to state, "Sir, I'm not just," but was cut off by Richard, who, with a face flushed with irritation, growled, "You're nothing but a cleaning lady." He ordered her to go back to your chemicals and let me run my company in peace, adding, "And next time, clean in silence." Unbeknownst to Richard, Kesha Washington had been a registered nurse for 15 years before losing everything in a fabricated scandal. This was a case of such brutal racial discrimination that it compelled her to take cleaning jobs to survive. Nevertheless, her medical intellect never ceased functioning. She had noticed the indicators for weeks: Richard's slowed coordination, occasional slurred speech, and episodes of disorientation, which he dismissed as stress from his business. All the symptoms pointed to a serious neurological condition that if left untreated could be fatal. Kesha responded with unsettling composure, "I understand perfectly, Mr. Brooks. I'll keep doing my job." But while Richard resumed his high-value calls, Kesha embarked on an action he would never anticipate. She discreetly started documenting everything, every symptom, every episode, every moment when his arrogance overcame his instinct for survival. Richard Brooks believed he maintained complete control over his company and the individuals beneath him. What he failed to grasp was that the woman cleaning his office harbored a secret that could save his life if he ceased being arrogant enough to listen. As Kesha quietly arranged her cleaning supplies, her expertly trained eyes continued their observation. She knew precisely what was occurring with Richard Brooks, and more crucially, she knew exactly how to address it. If you have ever felt underestimated due to your ethnicity or social standing, then you understand that occasionally, the most profound vindication is simply being correct when everyone else is mistaken. The text encourages subscribing to the channel to discover how a seemingly insignificant cleaning lady would become the sole individual capable of saving the life of the man who scorned her. 3 days later, Richard Brooks' condition had deteriorated and his arrogance had trebled. During an executive board meeting, Kesha observed him confusing the names of his own directors and reiterating the same question 3 times within a 10-minute span. When she discreetly moved closer to the conference table, she overheard fragments of a conversation that caused her alarm. James Morrison, the CFO, whispered with genuine concern, "Richard, are you okay? You seem confused today." Richard exploded, slamming his fist on the table, declaring, "Confused? I'm perfectly fine. Maybe you're not keeping up with my thinking. I've always been 3 steps ahead of everyone." Kesha noticed the subtle tremor in his left hand and the way he blinked repeatedly as if attempting to focus his vision. These were progressive neurological symptoms she had witnessed numerous times before when she worked in the neurology department at Metropolitan Hospital prior to her professional destruction. The scandal had commenced 5 years earlier when Kesha, then the head nurse on the night shift, publicly challenged Dr. Mitchell Barnes' excessive opioid prescriptions. She had meticulously documented that black patients consistently received lower doses of painkillers than white patients with identical conditions, while simultaneously being more swiftly labeled as drug seekers. During the disciplinary meeting, Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital director, asked, "Are you accusing an esteemed doctor of racism?" questioning, "Based on what scientific evidence?" Kesha replied that her claim was based on 15 years of experience and 200 pages of detailed documentation, which she placed on the table. However, the internal investigation proved to be a facade. Dr. Barnes was a personal friend of the CEO and a substantial donor to the hospital. Instead of reviewing her evidence, they constructed an alternative narrative, portraying Kesha as mentally unstable and projecting personal racial issues onto medical practice. The definitive blow came when they allegedly discovered she had violated medication protocols, fabricated allegations they could never substantiate, but which were sufficient to ruin her career. Within 6 months, she lost her nursing license, her professional reputation, and any hope of ever working in the medical field again. "People like you always think the world owes you something," Dr. Barnes had remarked on her final day, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He added, "Maybe it's time to accept that. Some places just aren't for you." Now, 5 years later, cleaning the office of the most powerful man in the pharmaceutical industry, Kesha perceived a bitter irony. Richard Brooks owned the company that produced the very opiates Dr. Barnes had selectively prescribed. Richard's sharp voice brought her back to the present, asking, "Are you still here?" The meeting had concluded, and he observed her with irritation, demanding, "How long does it take to clean a desk?" Kesha apologized, "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks. I was just being thorough." Richard laughed dismissively. "Thorough? You're a janitor, not a surgeon. Speed matters more than perfection in your line of work." Kesha nodded silently, but her trained eyes continued to register crucial details. Richard's right pupil was subtly more dilated than his left. His verbal responses exhibited a slight delay. His fine motor coordination was clearly impaired. These were classic indicators of increased intracranial pressure. "And another thing," Richard continued, adjusting his tie with movements less precise than usual. "Next time you have the brilliant idea of giving me medical advice, remember that I pay some of the best doctors in the country. I don't need the opinion of someone who cleans toilets for a living." The casual cruelty of his remarks cut deeply. Yet, Kesha maintained a neutral expression. She had learned to absorb humiliation without reacting, a skill cultivated over years of systematic discrimination. "I understand perfectly, sir," she replied, beginning to put away her cleaning supplies. But as she departed the office, Kesha made a resolute decision. That night, in her modest apartment, she opened her laptop and commenced typing. Not a formal medical report, as she no longer possessed the credentials for that. Instead, she initiated something different, a detailed anonymous letter addressed to Richard's wife, Margaret Brooks. Kesha had extensively researched the Brooks family. Margaret, although not having practiced in years, was a trained nurse. She would comprehend the medical terminology and recognize the severity of the symptoms described. Every word was meticulously chosen. Each symptom was documented with temporal precision. Every observation was supported by specific behavioral evidence. She completed the letter at 3 o'clock in the morning, reread it 5 times, and slipped it into an unmarked envelope. Richard Brooks believed he had silenced another inferior person. What he did not realize was that he had just awakened something far more formidable than mere anger. A trained nurse with an unwavering mission to save lives, even when those lives belonged to individuals who despised her. As Kesha sealed the envelope, a cold certainty settled within her chest. She would not allow Richard's arrogance to be his undoing, not because he deserved to live, but because she had sworn an oath to save lives. And some oaths transcend the treatment one receives from the people they save. What that billionaire CEO failed to perceive was that every insult merely strengthened the resolve of a woman who had already lost everything once and discovered she still possessed a great deal to offer the world, if only someone were humble enough to listen. The letter arrived in Margaret Brooks' hands on a quiet Tuesday, discreetly delivered by an anonymous courier. Margaret, a nursing graduate from Johns Hopkins University, immediately recognized the clinical precision of the language and the gravity of the observations detailed. She murmured, reading it for the 3rd time, progressive neurological symptoms, impaired motor coordination, episodes of temporal confusion. Each word in the letter echoed the concern she herself had attempted to express to her husband over the past few weeks, only to be dismissed with the same disdain he reserved for individuals he considered inferior. Margaret knew Richard was different. The angry outbursts had become more frequent and irrational. He forgot significant appointments, repeated the same stories at dinner parties, and his once impeccable handwriting now trembled like that of a much older man. She wondered, poring over every meticulously documented medical detail, who could have written this? Someone with formal training, definitely. Someone who watched Richard closely regularly. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor of Brooks Pharmaceutical, Kesha executed her plan with the precision of a seasoned nurse. During her cleaning rounds, she had discreetly begun documenting everything. Times of episodes, intensity of tremors, patterns of mental confusion. She had an unexpected ally in Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired neurologist who worked part-time as a medical insurance consultant in the adjacent building. Kesha had encountered her in the parking lot when Patricia remarked on recognizing nursing techniques in the way Kesha assisted an elderly woman who had stumbled. "You were a nurse," Dr. Williams had observed, not as a query, but as an assertion of fact. Kesha admitted to 15 years, awaiting the usual judgment. Instead, Patricia extended her hand, stating, "Neurologist for 30 and I still recognize competence when I see it." That casual conversation in the parking lot blossomed into an unlikely partnership. Dr. Williams, a 62-year-old black woman who had faced her own struggles against prejudice in medicine, immediately understood when Kesha described Richard's symptoms. Dr. Williams diagnosed during their conversation at the corner cafe, brain tumor, aneurysm, or something progressive like multiple sclerosis. She noted that any of those conditions could be fatal if left untreated. "Have you been documenting everything carefully?" Kesha showed her handwritten notebook where she had meticulously recorded every observation. Patricia nodded with professional approval, stating, "This man should have been undergoing neurological tests for weeks. His arrogance is going to kill him." Their plan was straightforward. Their objective was to provide sufficient evidence for Margaret Brooks to demand a complete neurological evaluation. However, Richard was making this difficult with his systematic refusal to acknowledge any problem. Richard had commented to Margaret over dinner that Dr. Harrison told him, "I may be working too hard," not realizing he had mistakenly referred to the dermatologist as if he were his cardiologist. He then added, "But I don't trust young doctors. They prefer to diagnose problems that don't exist." Margaret had exchanged a worried glance with their daughter Jessica, who was visiting for dinner. Jessica, a medical student in her final year, had also noticed the changes in her father. "Dad, when was the last time you had a complete checkup?" Jessica had asked delicately. "Checkups are for sick people," Richard had replied with growing irritation. "I built a pharmaceutical empire. I think I know when something is wrong with my own body." It was that same week that the most alarming episode occurred. Kesha was organizing the conference room when Richard walked in, visibly confused. "Where is everyone?" he asked, looking around the empty room. "The meeting was canceled, Mr. Brooks." "You canceled it yourself yesterday," Kesha replied gently. Richard stared at her with a blank expression, as if he didn't recognize her, even though she had been cleaning his office every day for 2 years. "Who are you?" he asked with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "I'm Kesha from the cleaning staff." "Kesha," he repeated her name several times as if trying to access a lost memory. "You said something about doctors earlier." For a terrifying moment, Kesha observed in Richard's dilated pupils the same lost look she had seen in neurological patients during her years in the hospital. The person behind those eyes was gradually disconnecting from reality. "Mr. Brooks, are you feeling all right?" she asked momentarily, forgetting her position. The question seemed to snap him back. "I'm fine," he growled, returning to his familiar hostile personality, "and you're not allowed to ask personal questions. Get back to your work." But Kesha had seen enough. That afternoon, she called Dr. Williams. "Time is running out," she said. "Today, he didn't recognize me for several minutes. This isn't just arrogance. It's active neurological deterioration," Patricia replied. "Then we need to speed up the plan. I'll call Margaret Brooks directly. As a doctor, I can use professional concern as an excuse." That night, while Richard slept heavily, another worrying symptom Margaret had noticed, she received a call from Dr. Williams. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Dr. Patricia Williams, neurologist. I have received some concerning information about your husband's symptoms, and I believe he needs immediate neurological evaluation." Margaret held the phone with trembling hands. "Doctor, I've been trying to convince him to seek help, but he refuses to listen. I understand completely. Unfortunately, it is common for patients with neurological conditions to lose the ability to recognize their own symptoms. This is called anosognosia, a consequence of the disease itself." The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When she hung up, Margaret had a definitive plan. The next day, she would do something she had never done in 25 years of marriage. She would confront Richard publicly, in front of people whose opinions he valued. She had invited the board of directors to an informal small family meeting to discuss the succession of the company, but in reality, it would be a medical intervention in disguise. Kesha, discreetly cleaning the hallway adjacent to the conference room, listened as Margaret explained the situation to Jessica and the directors. "My husband is sick, and his refusal to accept treatment is putting not only his life at risk, but the future of the company." What none of them knew was that in the next 24 hours, Richard Brooks' life would depend entirely on the courage of a cleaning lady he had treated as invisible. A woman who, despite all the contempt she had received, was about to do something that would define not only her character, but possibly save the life of the man who had humiliated her the most. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not destroying someone. It is saving them despite their unworthiness, proving that your humanity is infinitely superior to the cruelty you have received. But would Richard's pride allow him to accept help from someone he had always considered inferior? And what happens when saving a life means confronting an entire system that prefers to ignore the wisdom of those it considers worthless? The family intervention occurred on a stormy Thursday, precisely when Richard was at his most vulnerable. Margaret had orchestrated every detail with the precision of an experienced nurse. She invited the 5 top executives of Brooks Pharmaceutical to a strategic succession meeting at the family mansion. Richard descended the stairs, staggering slightly, attempting to disguise his compromised coordination with deliberately slow movements. His left side was noticeably weaker, and his speech occasionally slurred at the edges of words. "I don't understand why we need to discuss succession," he muttered to Margaret as he adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. "I'm perfectly capable of running my own company." "Of course you are, dear," Margaret replied, observing as he attempted to tie his tie 3 times before achieving an acceptable knot. In the boardroom, the directors immediately noticed the changes in Richard. James Morrison, the CFO, exchanged worried glances with Sandra Phillips, head of operations. When Richard referred to the marketing director as "that guy from the sales department," Dr. Williams, whom Margaret had invited as a medical consultant for executives, interjected, "Richard, I've observed some troubling symptoms during our previous meetings. Tremors, temporal confusion, impaired coordination." "There's nothing wrong with me." Richard exploded, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to knock over his coffee cup. "I'm tired of unqualified people trying to diagnose me." That was the critical moment it happened. Richard attempted to stand up to demonstrate his perfect health, but his legs completely gave out. He collapsed into his chair, the left side of his face beginning to twitch involuntarily, his eyes losing focus as he struggled to form words. I don't wear," he slurred, his right hand shaking violently as he attempted to reach for the glass of water. Margaret immediately dialed 911, but it was Dr. Williams who assumed control of the situation. "Acute neurological symptoms. Possible stroke or secondary seizure. We need immediate transport to the hospital." While awaiting the ambulance, something entirely unexpected transpired. Margaret received a call from someone she didn't anticipate, Kesha Washington. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Kesha from your husband's office cleaning crew. I'm calling because I need you to know that I've documented all of his symptoms over the past few weeks." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "You're a nurse." "I was before. I was forced to clean offices by people who treat me like I'm invisible." The bitterness in Kesha's voice was palpable, but something else was present too: absolute medical competence. "Your husband has classic signs of a brain tumor or aneurysm. The progressive symptoms, the cognitive decline, the unilateral tremors. It's all documented in my report." "What report?" "The one I sent to all of his company directors 3 days ago." The same one they ignored because it came from a mere cleaning lady. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. You sent it to the directors? 47 pages of detailed medical observations with precise timestamps and symptom analysis. Even a prognosis of deterioration if left untreated. Kesha explained that James Morrison dismissed it as employee paranoia, and Sandra Phillips suggested she be terminated for inappropriate behavior. The revelation struck Margaret like a punch to the stomach. As Richard was loaded into the ambulance, she fully comprehended the irony. The woman her husband had treated with the most contempt was the only person who had attempted to save his life. At the hospital, Dr. Chen's diagnosis confirmed every single word Kesha had spoken. A slow bleeding brain aneurysm causing progressive neurological symptoms. He stated that if it weren't for the intervention that day, Richard would have suffered a complete rupture within a few days, and death was almost certain. When Richard regained consciousness after emergency surgery, his first words were a hoarse whisper, where is the cleaning lady?" Margaret held his hand, still weak from the sedatives. "Kesha," she said, "she's in the hallway, dear. She's been waiting for 6 hours." He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his pale cheeks, acknowledging, "She tried to warn me. She tried several times. And you treated her like trash. I need to talk to her." When Kesha entered the room, Richard could barely maintain eye contact. The woman he had publicly humiliated stood there, still in her cleaning uniform, yet emanating a dignity that rendered his previous arrogance pathetic and insignificant. "You saved my life," he whispered. "I've been trying to save it for weeks. You chose to humiliate me instead." "I know," his voice faltered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you're right. You don't." Kesha pulled up a chair and sat down, maintaining a respectful distance, but stated, "I didn't save your life for you. I saved it because I swore an oath to protect lives. And some oaths are bigger than the treatment we receive from the people we save." Richard's humiliation was only just beginning. In the subsequent days, the full story leaked. The billionaire CEO who nearly died because he was too arrogant to listen to a nurse cleaner who had accurately identified his symptoms weeks earlier. Sandra Phillips and James Morrison attempted to suppress the scandal, but Margaret had retained copies of all communications where they ignored and ridiculed Kesha's medical concerns. Recordings where they suggested firing her for inappropriate behavior went viral on social media. The media transformed the case into a national emblem of discrimination in the corporate environment. "Black cleaner saves CEO who looked down on her" became the headline for weeks. The Brooks Pharmaceutical Board of Directors convened an emergency meeting. The company suffered a $300 million loss in market value within 3 days, and Richard was compelled to temporarily step down as CEO for medical recovery and to reflect on human resources policies. But the ultimate humiliation arrived when Richard learned that Kesha had rejected all offers of severance pay and paid interviews. "I don't need anyone's blood money," she informed reporters. "I need this to serve as an example. Competence and dignity don't depend on diplomas or skin color." While Richard recuperated from surgery, facing weeks of physical therapy to regain his motor coordination, Kesha quietly resumed her cleaning job. But now, every employee at Brooks Pharmaceutical treated her with the respect she had always deserved. The man who had dedicated his entire life to belittling inferior people had learned in the most humiliating manner possible that his very existence depended on the individuals he considered invisible. And the entire nation was witnessing his lesson in humility unfold on the national news. But did Richard truly internalize his lesson? And what would be the destiny of a woman who proved herself greater than all the prejudice directed at her? Sometimes the profoundest revenge is not destroying someone. It is compelling them to live knowing they owe their existence to those they always deemed inferior. 6 months later, Kesha Washington was honored with the National Heroine Award from the Surgeon General of the United States in a ceremony broadcast live across the country. The same cleaning uniform that had once been the object of ridicule was now enshrined in the National Museum of African American History with a plaque that read, "The uniform of a woman who proved that competence has no color." Richard Brooks observed from the front row in a wheelchair, which he still occasionally required due to the residual effects of surgery. His hands trembled slightly, no longer from the illness, but from the profound emotion of witnessing the woman he had humiliated being celebrated as she should have been from the very beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kesha stated into the microphone, her voice resonating through the packed auditorium. "For 15 years, I was a nurse. For 5 years, I was treated as if I were invisible. But today, I understand that I never stopped being what I always was, someone who saves lives, regardless of who recognizes it or not." Brooks Pharmaceutical had been compelled to implement drastic changes following the scandal. Sandra Phillips and James Morrison were fired for discriminatory conduct, and the company created a diversity program that swiftly became a national model. Ironically, the company's stock fully recovered after it demonstrated a genuine commitment to inclusion. Dr. Patricia Williams, now serving as the medical director of the newly established Kesha Washington Institute for Preventive Medicine, smiled from the audience. The institute, entirely funded by a $10 million anonymous donation from Richard Brooks, offered free medical training to individuals from underserved communities. "When that man told me to stay in my place," Kesha continued, "he didn't know that my place has always been saving lives. He just couldn't see past his own prejudices." Richard had attempted to reach out to her several times during his recovery. But Kesha maintained her distance out of respect, not out of anger, but because she understood that some lessons must be experienced in solitude to be truly learned. The public humiliation Richard endured was devastating, yet ultimately transformative. He lost friends, social influence, and was forced to confront decades of casual arrogance. But he also acquired something he had never possessed: genuine humility and profound respect for people he had always considered inferior. "Revenge," Kesha concluded her speech, "is not about making someone pay for what they did to us. True revenge is becoming so great that their smallness can no longer reach us." The ovation persisted for 8 minutes. Richard was among the first individuals to stand, applauding with tears streaming down his face. Later, in the hallway, he finally had an opportunity to speak briefly with Kesha. "I was an idiot," he stated simply. "You were," she agreed without hesitation. "But idiots can learn if they're humble enough. Thank you for saving me, even though I didn't deserve it." "I didn't save you because you deserved it," Kesha replied, adjusting the metal pin on her chest. "I saved you because some things are bigger than the treatment we receive, and because the best way to overcome prejudice is to prove that our humanity is greater than the cruelty of others." Richard nodded, knowing he would spend the remainder of his life striving to earn the forgiveness he had already received. Today, Kesha manages 3 community hospitals and trains doctors in advanced clinical observation. Richard has stepped away from business to dedicate himself entirely to philanthropy, particularly medical education programs for minorities. 2 lives were saved that day, one from a brain aneurysm, the other from terminal ignorance. The greatest revenge against those who devalue us is not to destroy them. It is to become so extraordinary that they spend the rest of their lives trying to comprehend how they could have been so blind. Kesha conclusively demonstrated that competence, inherent dignity, and genuine greatness do not depend on the approval of others, but solely on an unwavering commitment to embodying who we truly are. If this narrative resonated with your emotions, the text encourages subscribing to the channel for more stories that powerfully illustrate how our true strength manifests precisely when others attempt to diminish us.